Doing the impossible, losing fat, building muscle at the same time. The bottom line is, it is entirely possible. Protein seems to be at the forefront of it. But I have an expert in the world of muscle mass, and someone that really has dedicated their entire life's work to muscle, to strength, to protein. She's studied under some of the best. She's one of the most renowned medical doctors in this field. She's made a huge name for herself, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. So we're gonna go back and forth a little bit.
I can't wait. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'll let you kind of take it away on the muscle side initially, and then we'll kind of bounce back and forth. I'll tackle fat loss, you tackle muscle.
I just love this conversation because the two major issues as we age, you ready? Number one, loss of skeletal muscle, and number two, gain in body fat. These are the things that really plague us as we age from a body composition perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting, and they both go hand in hand, and they both feed off of each other. And people tend to think that they need to tackle both separately, when in reality, there's so much overlap because a lot of the things that we're doing for muscle are the same things that we do for fat loss. So letting you sort of lead off, like what are some sort of these keys, like one key that people need to be paying attention to when it comes down to building muscle?
Yeah, I mean, really nailing your protein. And the current recommendation is 0.8 grams per kg. And there's some great studies out there that have done graded protein studies. So they'll look at an individual's body composition at 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein, and then they'll double it to 1.6, so they'll do 2 times the RDA, 1.6 grams per kg. And then the third one will be 3 times the RDA. And what they found was that individuals who were also undergoing resistance training, that they lost more weight in terms of fat mass and maintained skeletal muscle and lean mass by simply doubling the RDA. And their body essentially was going through recomposition.
Interesting. And all they did is, and this is in tandem with resistance training, right?
This was in tandem with resistance training.
Okay, so all they did in this case is minimal double the RDA, which is not saying much, to be candid.
That's right. But it's amazing that when looking at the RDA group, when they were dieting, so this was groups in calorie deficit, they lost 50% of lean body mass, 40 to 50% lean body mass.
Really?
Yes, so eating the RDA and then going into a calorie deficit does very little for body composition.
Disaster, yeah.
It's a disaster. So yes, you might lose weight, but 50% of that weight could be skeletal muscle or lean tissue.
Let's pivot to supplements for just a minute, talking about the muscle building side and the fat loss side. If we cut through all the noise out there of all kinds of like muscle building garbage supplements that are out there, like if people's focus from a longevity perspective, but also building muscle, losing fat, what are the best sort of like muscle building supplements they should focus on?
So I would say here are my top, I'm gonna give you my top 4 supplements.
Okay.
Number 1, creatine, and not in no particular order. Creatine, omega-3 fatty acids. It's been shown to have impact on skeletal muscle, which even more so on females than males. I think there's some evidence to support that. Urolithin A, and I said vitamin D and creatine. That's it.
That's pretty simple. Now,
and by the way, if someone is eating a high red meat diet, they may or may not need more creatine.
Can you elaborate a little bit more maybe on mitophagy and like urolithin A?
Yeah, I would love to. When we think about how we examine our overall health and the things that we can do, that can be challenging, right? Because we want to know that what we are putting in our body is giving us a result, right?
Yes.
Some of us like to eat pomegranate or walnut, and we think that just because something has a phytonutrient or, again, something within a food matrix, that we are actually getting those things. But that doesn't always happen. And urolithin A is a postbiotic. It comes from an ellagitannin, this group of compounds called ellagitannins, which are found in pomegranate or walnut, typically these plant sources. And 30 to 40% of individuals do not have the gut microbiome to generate urolithin A. I don't know, have you ever taken a test?
No, I haven't taken the test, but I'm aware that, that's very small.
So there's a small population that can do it. I haven't taken the test either, but urolithin A is a compound that has a lot of good data, randomized controlled trials in older adults, and we're seeing it in athletes to improve this concept of mitophagy, which is the regeneration and cleaning out of these old mitochondrial cells, which you have to do. You have to rebuild and repair so that things, are much more effective and efficient. one of the things that happens with aging is our ability to turn over mitochondria declines. And so a way to support it is through urolithin A. And I am very hard pressed to be impressed with data. I am very impressed with the urolithin A data.
Yeah, the bit that I've seen as well, it's very impressive.
Yes.
And it's sort of this theory that floats around there that has a lot of logic and reasoning to it, that, okay, as you get older, and if your let's pretend your mitochondria is becoming more dysfunctional, which more than likely it is as you get older, there's always a delicate balance of that mitochondria having, its daughter mitochondria and ultimately, basically the proliferation of mitochondria. But from a DNA standpoint, since mitochondria has its own DNA, if you have dysfunctional mitochondria, it's like a dysfunctional family having dysfunctional children, right? And like eventually you can end up down this rabbit hole. And there's literature to reinforce that, although it's, it's fairly mechanistic, but it makes a lot of sense. Then when you look at, okay, in an aging population, enhancing mitochondrial health so that those mitochondria can still, let's just call it procreate. That's a very simple way of putting it, but it's not how it is. You're creating more mitochondria, right? Especially if you're putting the stops in place to create more mitochondria in the first place, exercise, resistance training, yada, yada. I'll put a link down below for Timeline, which you and I both talk about this. Yeah. Pretty much the only patented way to get urolithin A.
Well, and also the evidence is so good for it. There's years and years of data. It starts with mechanistic data, move to animal models and then to humans. And when we start to see randomized controlled trials in humans that hold up, especially when it improves endurance and strength, that is something I pay attention to as a practicing physician.
If you're interested in learning more about that, there's a company called Timeline and MitoPure that has a patented technology. It's been published in JAMA to induce mitophagy. Definitely recommend you check them out and learn a little bit more, but I popped a link down below. It's a product called MitoPure by Timeline. There's a 10% off discount link code there, Thomas10 at timelinenutrition.com/Thomas. And again, has nothing to do with being contrived with this video. It's a thoughtful mention of something that makes sense. They've been a sponsor on this channel before, so I do recommend you check them out. At the very least, just read up on it and see if it's something that is appealing to you. So that link is down below, top line of the description underneath this video. Okay, and I'm gonna couple that with sort of my perspective from the fat loss side specifically. And it goes exactly with what you're talking about. That is what I talk about as energy flux, g-flux. And we have this theory that we need to just simply eat less, right? We need to eat less, and when we eat less, unfortunately, all kinds of things go down, like our non-exercise activity thermogenesis, all kinds of things that are very important. So I've come up with this pretty strong mantra of eat more, move more, right? And sometimes you have to lose a little weight first before you kind of do that. I don't want people to get the wrong idea and say, I'm gonna go to In-N-Out Burger and get 2,000 calories of food, and then I'm gonna go move a little bit more. It has to be commensurate, right? If you eat 1,000 more calories, you should be moving 1,000 more calories. But the idea behind G-flux and energy flux is that, let's pretend for a second, you eat 2,000 calories per day and burn 2,000 calories per day. And I eat 5,000 calories per day and burn 5,000 calories per day. On the surface, this looks like we're both at net zero. But the reality is that someone that eats more and moves more is actually burning more, because there's an energy cost associated with just the mobilization of fuels and all the enzymes and processes that happen with turnover in the first place. And this just goes hand in hand with everything you're saying. Get resistance training, prioritize your movement, and prioritize more quality fuel in tandem with that. Because for fat loss and muscle mass, in the longevity perspective, that is how you're gonna maintain a high metabolic rate.
Yes. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because adding in more dietary protein has had some counter effect of that adaptive thermogenesis. When individuals are trying to lose weight, it seems as if dietary protein can help protect from that metabolic slowing.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got sort of the protein and energy side. What else can people be doing when they're focusing on muscle mass?
They have to do resistance training.
Okay.
That's really what is going to move the needle. And whether it's 3 days a week, 10 to 20 sets per body group, you have to do resistance training. And that is very clear in the literature if you care about maintaining and building skeletal muscle and improving body composition.
Interesting. Yeah, so you're thinking, when you say 10 to 20 sets, do you think someone doing like a full body type split where they're just hitting maybe one muscle group or hitting all muscle groups for just a couple of sets. Like maybe they come in, okay, I'm gonna do like 2 sets of squats, 2 sets of deadlifts, 2 sets of shoulder press. Like what is sort of the minimum effective amount? Like,
I don't even wanna tell you because this is so much less than you think. When I was in my undergraduate, I worked on some of these earlier studies with Don Layman, and he looked at this. And he wasn't super public about the amount of, so he looked at 2 groups of individuals, and they were both on calorie restriction, so they were at 1,600 calories. One group was kind of the food guide pyramid, so 55% carbohydrates. The other was a 40-30-30 protein, carbohydrates, or carbohydrates, proteins, and fats.
Okay.
And what he found, and by the way, 2 days of resistance training, and the resistance training was like yoga and body weight.
Sorry,
okay?
I shouldn't laugh.
No, but what they found, what is so amazing, is that was such a very minimal stimulus that those individuals still improved their body composition. The individuals with the higher protein diet, with not much movement, not much exercise, 2 days a week, lost more body fat, maintained lean body mass, because obviously he wasn't looking at skeletal muscle as the ways that we've talked about in some of the other videos. They improved blood sugar regulation, improved triglycerides, and improved insulin sensitivity. And it wasn't a ton of exercise. And I don't want to say that because I think the advice to just do something is better than nothing is not great advice. We do have to do targeted exercise because that's really what is going to move the needle in the long term. But the evidence would suggest that the minimum effective dose, if nutrition is right, it's not really that much.
I mean, there's the operative words there though, if nutrition is right.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot of times, I mean, it's difficult for people to nail that part, right?
Yeah.
And from a fat loss perspective, I am a huge fan of simply walking, right? Obviously resistance training, that goes without saying, but when it comes down to just like the pure, like immediate sort of fat loss effect. And some people fight me on this because they say, hey, like, calories for calorie, like go out and do the high intensity stuff because it's gonna burn more calories. And I don't disagree because I do understand that although like going for a walk doesn't burn a lot of calories, it does burn more calories from fat, right, as a percentage. Although if you look at the absolute, yeah, you're gonna burn more calories doing a high intensity exercise. But I look at multiple different factors. I look at the fact that walking is tremendous for fat loss because it's passive. You can do a million other things while you're doing it. You can listen to a podcast, you can talk on the phone.
You cannot change your kid's diaper while you are walking though.
I've done it. And there's a number of other things. Like for example, it's easy on the joints, it's sustainable, right? And there's literature that suggests that even walking can help preserve the muscle mass in the legs, right? Like it's like just getting those steps in. So is it the absolute best for fat loss? Well, no. I mean, I think that if you went out for a run, you might burn more fat. But I think for sustainability and for the realistic nature of it, I think walking is hugely underrated. And because there are some influencers that got a lot of popularity talking about the benefits of 10,000 steps, you have all these people, even in the scientific community, that are starting to just be contrarian and say like, no, it's not about walking, it's not about walking. I'm here to say that like, if people were to just walk and like put that in a slightly different category than their resistance training exercise and create a very bold line between the two, that they would see huge changes. Because I think that's where the lines get blurred and people think, I'm gonna go for a walk and that is my activity. Or I'm gonna go-
And you're saying it's not. You're saying you should be walking as part of your daily life. And that is not exercise, but you should be doing it.
I think walking, even when it's deliberate, it can be exercise, but for most people, walking should be roped into your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It should be part of your life. And that's why I do think steps are a really good thing to look at for most people because they gamify it. They gamify it for me. Like if I look and I'm like, shoot, I'm at 9,000 steps. I wanna get to 10,000. You know what? I gotta run into the store. I'm gonna park at the back of the parking lot. Because it's reinstilled this lifestyle for me. So no matter how people wanna come at the whole walking for fat loss thing, there's no denying that it changes the paradigm in which we look at our non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is huge in the long term for fat loss.
I mean, I think that that's a great perspective. And by giving someone something to shoot for, a target, it can be very effective. But what also I really like that you're saying is that it is not a replacement for resistance training?
Not at all.
Or other kinds of modality of exercise?
Not at all. I put them in an entirely different bucket because although there is some overlap, they both get your heart rate going. They both, certainly have overlap. But resistance training is in a whole different category for me, and that is something that is always going to be supplemental, whereas walking is just ingrained into like daily life.
Yeah, I like that. Do you think that 10,000 steps are enough?
I think it's a pretty arbitrary number, but I think that when you look at some of the literature, I can't remember which journal it was published in, but basically they looked at the difference between going from 0 to 3,800 steps was a marked decrease in all-cause mortality. Like the biggest decrease was from 0 to 3,800 steps. From 3,800 to 5,800 steps, it was like another 5 to 7% decrease in all-cause mortality. From 5,800 to 7,800, it was like another 5 to 7%. And then there was a nice little leap from 7,800 up to, I think, 10,900. There's a little bit bigger jump. It seems as though there might be a line of diminishing return after a certain amount. However, what gets interesting with walking is with all-cause mortality, that's a pretty hard thing to quantify because perhaps people that walk more, maybe they're working construction and they're also swinging sledgehammers and doing other things, right? So when you're looking at large cohorts of people that get lots of steps, it's not people that are like, oh, I'm deliberately going to get my steps in. It's people that might just be more active people, or they're cognizant of it to begin with. So they also take care of their nutritional health and things like that. So it's a very difficult thing to look at.
Yeah, I think that those are all really good points. And one other thing that I think is important to mention is that when an individual is untrained, their ability to go through body recomposition seems to be quicker versus someone who potentially is very well trained. It may be more difficult to put on muscle mass like for you or lose body fat. Where would you lose it, right? Versus an individual who is just starting out. I think that their experience with recomposition is going to happen faster. And I think the literature would support that, than an individual who's untrained going from an untrained state to a trained state, just purely based on muscle. We see improvements.
Any other keys for building muscle?
I mean, I think that we've covered the fundamentals. Okay, I'll give you one. Sleep. So there's some new evidence to support that one night of sleep deprivation will suppress muscle protein synthesis by 18%.
We read the same paper.
You did?
I was mouthing the words as you said.
Really?
Yeah.
So that is my friend Emily that I would love to introduce you. That is out of her. That's out of her lab.
Yep. Yeah. Literally filmed the videos. Like, like doing or failing to do this.
So this is out of the Galveston. This is the Galveston group. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. That's insanely scary.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, in this paper, I don't know if there was additional data. Did they look beyond just one day, or was it just because it was one night of full sleep deprivation, right?
So I don't know if she's published this yet, but it was one day of full sleep deprivation and muscle protein synthesis was suppressed for a few days after.
Wow.
And they did look at 4 and 5 days of sleep deprivation like you would see in the SEAL teams.
Yeah.
And what they found is that there was some offset with heavy activity.
So I have a video in my queue to film that was looking at that, like when you're sleep deprived, resistance training is a very important thing to do.
Yeah.
I think this is a huge piece to touch on. So why is that?
Mechanistically, I'm not totally sure. And again, I just recently had her on my podcast, and from a mechanistic perspective, we are not totally sure.
Yeah. And it's so much easier.
But it doesn't have to do with the recovery aspect. Everybody talks about sleep from recovery. This is not the recovery. This is actually skeletal muscle blunting. There is a response blunted in the tissue.
And it's funny because there's older research I think it was in the PJs, the pararescue guys, I think where they looked at total sleep deprivation had very little impact, surprisingly, on their actual physical performance in a sleep deprived state, which was wild. It blew my mind. Basically, they get sleep deprived guys, and their actual absolute physical performance didn't really change, but what did change is their mental motor, right? Their ability to handle that, sort of their way to kind of prefrontal cortex their way through and get that willpower to get through. And that obviously is going to govern a lot downstream. But their absolute strength and things like that, I would imagine over time that would deteriorate.
Yes,
but one night of sleep. So it just goes to demonstrate that what's happening is at a very molecular, mechanistic level. So can this essentially or potentially be overridden by just resistance training in spite of that?
I think that is a difficult statement for me to make In an acute response situation, yes. But long-term sleep deprivation from a blood glucose regulation, cortisol and insulin, we see with shift workers, they don't do that well.
Yeah.
Increased risk for cancer. I remember when I was on call at nights, my blood sugar was high.
Yeah.
And I wasn't eating anything different. It was purely this misalignment of my circadian rhythm.
Yeah. Yeah, and the catecholamine response
Totally.
from just being stressed.
Every time that pager goes off, I like tuck my white coat under. Someone call the doctor.
Yeah. It's so wild. So with resistance training, like when you're sleep deprived too, it is such an easy thing to do compared to like trying to get the motivation to go do a Metcon or like cardio.
And by the way, people, do not do a Metcon with Thomas.
I put all my favorite guests through.
I'm just kidding.
Like if I'm super sleep deprived, I usually default to resistance training. And I don't mean to say this in a sense that like it's to kind of poo-poo it, but like resistance training is easier for me to do in sort of a zombie state, right? I'm not gonna go do a submaximal lift or something like that. I'm gonna keep it in a healthy range, but like, I'm like, okay, I don't have to get my heart rate crazy high. I can still, and I feel like, okay, great. Like I'm giving myself a little bit of a pass, but I'm still like getting some movement going. And it sounds like that's been like the right thing to do, because when you look at the other literature, it suggests that like from a heart rate variability stance and all these other metrics, like taxing your central nervous system with a balls to the wall high intensity or interval training session after sleep deprivation is detrimental.
Right.
So it's like, okay, if you didn't sleep well, you actually get yourself a little bit of a pass, go lift some weights.
Yeah.
And you're gonna like have some positive impact there, and you're not gonna tax your CNS so you can actually sleep tonight. Interesting.
I think it's a great strategy. And I think we're going to start to see more of the molecular mechanisms of skeletal muscle interface and sleep deprivation over time.
I'm curious to unpack a little bit more of the glucose piece too, because like obviously sleep is like very critical for glucose regulation. And I've done some 180s back and forth in different categories with this as far as fat loss is concerned. So on one hand, I think, okay, your insulin levels are high because your glucose is high. Insulin inhibits lipolysis, which, directly is going to inhibit fat loss. Like that makes a lot of sense. Even if it flies in the face of like a simple theory of calories in, calories out. However, I'm sure if you're still in a deficit, you'll lose weight, but maybe you're losing the wrong kind of weight because you're inhibiting lipolysis. So on one hand, I'm like, okay, sleep deprivation could be really, really bad if like your glucose levels are chronically high as a result, and you're not able to kind of tap into that fat burning. I'm sure there's ways to resolve this, but typically speaking, I have advised people, and I typically follow the protocol myself, that if I didn't sleep well and my glucose is high, I tend to keep carbohydrates lower that day.
That's a great strategy.
I just feel like it's an easy thing to do. It's an easy lever to pull. And at the very least, I'm certainly not doing any damage.
Yeah, I would do that when I was on call. I think that's a great and easy strategy. If you do not sleep well, if you are under sleep restriction or deprivation, the next day or even that night, if you are up, minimizing your carbohydrate load, I think is a really good strategy. Because again, when your glucose is elevated, especially during times of stress, it's not necessarily because you're eating. When I was on call and I was measuring my blood sugar, I wasn't necessarily eating, but it was a very stressful situation. My blood sugar was elevated. And it wasn't because I was eating more.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny is, anecdotally, like most of the surgeons that I know tend to, like if they're running hot, they tend to reduce carbohydrates because they say I'm less shaky, I'm actually more even. I'm like, especially if I'm, doing really long surgeries. And it's, again, this is not a hit piece on carbohydrates. Like I love carbohydrates.
Yeah.
I just earn them typically, and it's not to say that like when I sleep deprived, I didn't earn my carbohydrates. It's more of a stopgap. It's just like, okay, if I know that this mechanism exists, then it would be foolish for me not to. But the question that I have for you is, if muscle protein synthesis decreases, could we offset that? Like, should we increase our protein on days that we're post-sleep deprived?
I would say that, I don't see evidence for that, but it would be a great strategy. If muscle protein synthesis is suppressed, I do think ways in which you could initiate it would be very beneficial. Also, you still have to eat something. And if I were to choose, I would choose dietary protein.
I want to double click on fish oil, omega-3s for a second. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the literature is super fascinating. I'm quite aware of it, but I want you to kind of explain a little bit. Like I've seen cool evidence on protein synthesis, on insulin sensitivity, post-workout omega-3 utilization for increasing protein synthesis? Like,
yeah, and again, I'm not an expert on fish oil omega-3, but from the literature, there's a few things that I think are very interesting. I haven't seen it directly impact muscle protein synthesis, but there is some literature to suggest that it affects the ribosomal content and it impacts the ribosome of skeletal muscle, which I think could be very interesting. And there is some evidence that it lowers inflammation. And I would say that lowers inflammation systemically. We see that in C-reactive protein. And we know that elevated levels of C-reactive protein it can be a risk factor for disease states, especially cardiovascular disease. So I think that there's a lot of evidence emerging really about the impact of omega-3 fatty acids on skeletal muscle.
Yeah.
And also even in the incorporation of it.
Yeah, totally. It's cool because that's going to be one that I would focus on the fat loss side as well, like especially from insulin sensitivity standpoint. Like if you are metabolically unhealthy, like these kinds of fats coming from EPA and DHA show really promising evidence with insulin sensitivity, which has a dual effect with potentially muscle protein synthesis. The more insulin sensitive you are, then maybe you can get that little impact with an insulin spike along with protein, possibly more insulin sensitive from a leucine spike with that. I digress, but from a fat loss perspective, just like I had mentioned before, like if your insulin levels are high and you're inhibiting lipolysis, but if you can start to increase that insulin sensitivity a little bit more, then perhaps you can bring those insulin levels down a little bit more. But I also just think just for general health, it's one of the most important supplements that you could take.
Yes, I would agree with you.
And so vitamin D is on your list for building muscle.
Well, I think it's really important for muscle health. And one of the things, again, as a geriatrician, is I am concerned about falls.
Yeah.
And there are vitamin D receptors on skeletal muscle. And we know that it is a risk factor for muscle health, low vitamin D levels, just because of that.
And then from a fat loss perspective, it makes perfect sense too. And there's I don't know if you've heard about how essentially vitamin D is sequestered in fat cells.
Yes.
So the more overweight someone is, the more their vitamin D gets soaked up into their fat. So it's like in the process of losing fat, you might need to be saying, hey, when I'm starting out, my dose needs to be higher. And then as you lose fat, you might be able to kind of titrate that dose and kind of bring it down and find your sweet spot.
Yeah. And you can see that in the blood work too.
Yeah.
That if you're dosing an individual who has more fat to lose, and let's say you're dosing them at 10,000 IUs of vitamin D and you're still not seeing an improvement, they sometimes have to be dosed higher.
Yeah, and I think just from a fat loss perspective, it's cool. There's so much like whey protein, like it's on the same list, muscle building and fat loss. Because of this, obvious reasons for the muscle building, but for the fat loss side, the satiety effect is a huge one, and just the kind of collaborative effect of saying like, hey, we're building muscle, then it's going to be a better metabolic.
Even there's also immunoglobulins. So there's alpha-lactalbumin and lactoferrin and these immunoglobulins that exist within whey protein that can help with inflammation.
Specifically concentrate in that case, right?
Yes. That can help with inflammation and have some immune modulating effects.
It's kind of funny because, one of the things that we learn in what we do with our line of work is that you have to be okay with changing your mind on things sometimes. And I have no problem with whey protein isolate. In fact, I still think as far as pure protein, it's clean, it's pure, it's simple. If I just want pure unadulterated protein, I'm gonna go for isolate. I used to kind of bag on concentrate. And now, as I've taken a more holistic approach in terms of being I want as close to the whole food as possible, I've realized that lactoferrin and having those immunoglobulins from whey protein concentrate is super important for the gut, but also for the immune system and and I actually, if I can get past the initial digestive issues that I kind of had with concentrate, which went away within a couple of weeks of just being consistent with it, I'm starting to think I might be more of a concentrate guy now.
Yeah, I love it.
So it's kind of wild.
You're rethinking food in terms of a whole matrix.
Yeah. I still think isolate has a great place.
It does, especially for more mature adults that can't tolerate whey and really need to get their protein in.
So for fat loss supplements, for me, I'll add into the mix caffeine. Caffeine is the most studied ergogenic aid that we know of. It's tied pretty close with creatine as far as most heavily researched with the most evidence behind it as an ergogenic aid. When it comes down to fat loss, some of the clearest evidence that's there. I mean, whether it's because it's increasing your RMR because it's like getting you to move more, or there's actual, cyclic adenosine monophosphate kind of like activation that is literally helping you burn more fat. The mobilization of fat from caffeine is a very real thing. So like I always tell people, like make no mistake, like the best fat loss supplement that you could probably have is your cup of black coffee in the morning. And there's even some weird evidence suggesting that caffeine might help with muscle growth. But the only thing that might conflict in our two discussions here would be the co-ingestion of caffeine and creatine at the same time. Have you seen that?
I haven't.
Yeah, so when I had Dr. Darren Kandel on here, he was kind of speculating some of this based on some of the research, but then within the last couple of months, some literature has come out that is pretty compelling that, taking caffeine and creatine, they occupy similar receptors for transport. So if you take your creatine in the morning, you may want to separate it from your coffee by at least an hour. So it seems as though they don't mix.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
It doesn't negatively impact the caffeine, but the caffeine negatively impacts the creatine.
Interesting. Okay. So I have a question for you. Have you looked at green coffee extract, chlorogenic acid?
So chlorogenic acid is from a fat loss perspective, no. As an antioxidant, it has some pretty compelling research behind it. I am still inclined to go the theaflavin route. I think that I get more out of catechins from like the green tea and the EGCG than I do out of chlorogenic acid, but perhaps there's a co-administration that could be really interesting. What's your take on it?
I think green coffee has all of them.
Yeah.
Unroasted green coffee. I mean, it's very difficult to get, but.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's something that I'd like to explore a little bit more because there's, we talked about it a little bit in one of our videos, but the relationship between coffee and frailty, coffee consumption and more mobility and less frailty as people get older. And there's one camp that suggests it's just because the caffeine is making them more mobile, because it's getting them more active and they're moving more. And that's a huge piece of it and probably is the main piece. And then there's another camp that thinks that it has to do with the chlorogenic acid.
Interesting.
Yeah, they think that it has to do with more CGA, it has to do more with the antioxidant effect, and that's actually reducing inflammation enough that they're actually more mobile. And so I think it's probably a combination, but the chlorogenic acid, that there's been a huge resurgence of that as far as popularity is concerned.
I've been interested in it forever. There was this company that I used to use their green coffee. It was called Sun Up. It was amazing. Yeah. And they had high levels of chlorogenic acid.
Yeah, I think we need to start doing some more deep dives on this. And that's the cool thing about social media and where we're at now is like, as these discussions start to happen, it's going to spawn some more research out of it because people are like, hey, there's interest here, especially when there's something where there's potential money behind it too. Or like, oh, cool, like coffee industry can get behind this. There's a lot of, so we've got all of that. Yeah. Well, Dr. Lyon, where can everyone find you?
They can find me on my website, drgabriellelyon.com, and on Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and then of course my podcast, also called the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show. Very original, I know. I have a great newsletter. I have a provider course coming, by the way, for physicians, a muscle-centric medicine course coming. And find me on all the channels.
Perfect. Well, as always, keep it locked here on the channel, and thank you so much.